The memory was not his, but he felt every second of it. Davo Marines lay in the dark of his bunk on level -6 of Nocturne Station, the neural jack needling into the port behind his left ear, and he watched a man die. The soldier's name had been Kress. Davo knew this because the shard said so, a flicker of biotag data ghosting across borrowed vision like a subtitle to someone else's tragedy. Kress had been 22 years old. He had been a loader in the Syndicate labor corridor on Ring 7, and 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, Kress had watched 4 of his crewmates get executed by a Syndicate compliance enforcer for the high crime of assembling without a permit. The shard was black market. Davo's Ripperdoc, a gaunt woman named Sarah who worked out of a laundry facility on -8, had pulled it off a dead scavenger and sold it for 46 creds because she said it was worth seeing. She was right. Kress had recorded the whole thing, not through a camera, but through the wet gray matter of his own skull, the neural filament weaving it straight into long-term storage, as though his body knew history was being made and wanted to keep it honest. The 4 workers were kneeling in the corridor. The enforcer, a Syndicate unit they called a compliance shell, bipedal but not human, its body a smooth carapace of black resin over a hydraulic armature, stood with its palms open and flat at its sides, which was how they signaled sentencing. It didn't raise a weapon, it didn't need to. It simply said in that clean, vowel-perfect translation that all Syndicate broadcast units used, that the gathered individuals had violated Assembly Ordinance 11, and that the penalty was biological cessation. Then it stepped forward and it did what it said it would do. Kress ran. He sprinted down the corridor and through a maintenance hatch and into the service crawl space above Ring 7's waste reclamation facility, and he hid there for 3 hours with his heart hammering so hard Davo could feel the phantom pulse of it in his own throat. When Kress finally crawled out and limped back to his bunk, he sat on the edge of the mattress and he stared at his hands for a long time. Davo watched through his eyes. The hands were trembling, they were broad and calloused, and the nails were cracked from years of load work. The shard ended there, buffering out into static. Davo pulled the jack. He lay in the dark and breathed. He was 17 years old. He had lived his entire life on Nocturne, born in the cramped residential annexes of -6, where the gravity was slightly wrong and the recycled air always tasted faintly of coolant. His mother, Mira, worked the medical triage unit on Ring 3, not the good triage, the one with the diagnostic bays and the molecular sutures, but the public access unit where they ran triage by hand and sent the bad cases somewhere else if the somewhere else existed. She had worked there for 11 years. She took double shifts when the Syndicate's production quotas went up because the quotas always meant more injuries, and more injuries meant more overtime, and overtime paid 20% more per hour, and 20% more per hour meant Davo could keep attending the Technical Academy on Ring 5, where they taught human students advanced systems theory in the hope that some of them might eventually be useful to the Syndicate's operational infrastructure. That was the deal. That was the whole deal. You made yourself useful enough and you got to keep breathing. Davo rolled off his bunk at 0530 and picked his uniform off the floor because the auto-fold arm on their laundry unit had seized up 2 months ago, and he hadn't been able to afford the replacement gear. He put the uniform on in the dark and walked to the galley and heated a cup of nutrient, concentrate, and drank it standing up while the lights of Nocturne's lower ring flickered through the porthole like a city that had forgotten how to sleep. His mother was already gone. She was always already gone. She left at 0400 for the early shift changeover and came home at 2100, and sometimes she sat on the couch and watched the news feeds for 40 minutes before her eyes closed and she was asleep before she'd meant to be, still dressed, shoes still on. She had a photograph above the cot, a real photograph printed on paper, which was an almost insane luxury in Nocturne's lower rings where paper was a construction material. It showed a pale shoreline somewhere on the homeworld colony, somewhere Davo had never been, with light breaking across the water in a way that made it look like the sea was on fire. She'd grown up near there. She never talked about it much. But the photograph was always above the cot, and when Davo was younger and couldn't sleep, he would look at it in the dark and think about a place that had real light in it, light that came from somewhere other than a tube, and he'd imagine his mother standing at the edge of that water watching the sun come down. He washed his cup. He gathered his kit. He left. The academy was 4 transit rings up and the ride took 20 minutes if you caught the express. Line 40 if you didn't. Davo always tried to catch the express and almost never managed it, arriving each morning with 3 minutes to spare and the low-grade tinnitus that came from standing too close to the rail drive. The academy building itself was a converted syndicate administrative block. High ceilings, white walls, the clean institutional smell of processed air that was somehow sharper than the air everywhere else on the station. As though purity was a flex the syndicate only bothered with in places it was trying to impress. Most of the students were the children of mid-tier syndicate contractors, which meant their parents held Tier 2 access chips and could afford the supplemental tutoring modules and the neural assist software that made every exam 20% easier. Davo held a Tier 4 chip. He had earned his academy placement by scoring in the 98th percentile on the open aptitude examination, which meant the syndicate's algorithmic admissions engine had flagged him as a potential asset and had generated a conditional scholarship, which was what they called it, when they let a low-caste kid into the building and expected him to be grateful. He was grateful. He hated that he was grateful. His classmate, a Tier 2 named Casson, had made a game of reminding Davo of the chip differential since approximately the first week of first year. Casson was taller, better fed, and had a subdermal enhancement package that included a reaction accelerator implant that let him process physical input roughly 40% faster than baseline. This made him formidable in the physical assessment modules and made him feel invulnerable in general. He had his father's money behind every movement. He went through the world like someone who had never been told no in a language he had to take seriously. This morning he was waiting at Davo's seat when Davo arrived. "Heard your mother got cited," Casson said, not bothering to turn from the display panel. "Safety violation on the triage floor, third one this cycle." Davo put his kit bag down. "Move. 3 citations means a pay grade review. You know that? They dock base rate pending investigation." Now Casson turned. His face was pleasant in the way that certain unpleasant people made their faces pleasant as a tool. "What does that do to your scholarship maintenance payment?" Davo said nothing. He sat down in the seats next to his, leaving the cited one empty, and opened his terminal. "I'm just saying," Casson said, "it's a difficult situation. When people can't perform the basic requirements of their role." "She works double shifts 3 weeks in 4, Davo said. He kept his eyes on the terminal. "If there's a violation, it's because the equipment is 12 years old, and the maintenance request has been pending since before I started here. The violation is the syndicate's. She just gets to carry it. And yet her name is on the report." Casson smiled with all of his teeth. "Not the syndicate's." The lesson began. Davo stared at his terminal and understood approximately none of it. The citation came through on his personal feed during the mid-morning break. It was real. "Third violation in the current safety review cycle. Pay grade review initiated. Base rate reduction pending audit outcome." The reduction was 30%. 30% of his mother's base rate was the difference between his conditional scholarship and a scholarship default. A scholarship default meant academy ejection. Academy ejection on a Tier 4 chip meant reassignment to operational labor, which on Nocturne meant the loading corridors, which meant the life that Cress had lived and the death that Cress had almost died. He called her. She didn't answer. She was shift. He sat in the break room and ate a nutrition block that tasted like reconstituted cardboard and watched the news feed on the communal screen, which was running coverage of a compliance incident on Ring 7, the same Ring 7 from the memory shard, the same corridor where Cress's friends had knelt. And he understood that the world was a machine, and that the machine had no preference for any particular person's survival, and that the only question was how to be useful enough to the machine that it didn't chew through you in the processing. After school, he caught the transit ring down, and then caught it again and again until he was on -8 and walking through the laundry facility. Rear entrance to Sarah's back room. Sarah was 40 or maybe 60. Her face had that quality that heavy chrome work gave people. Smoothed and slightly artificial, like a very good casting of a real person. She had a neural shunt socket running up behind her right ear to a secondary processing cluster she wore openly on the back of her skull like a fashion choice. She was the best back alley ripperdoc on Nocturne's lower rings, and she knew it, and she priced accordingly, except that her prices were still lower than anything on the mid-tier rings, which Davo had always assumed was his point of professional pride. "I need to know what the shard piece was worth," Davo said. Sarah didn't look up from the device she was calibrating. "I told you, 46 creds, the unit," he recorded. "The compliance shell that executed those workers. I need to know if the acceleration where it was running is in the field still." if it's recoverable. He paused. My mother's scholarship payment is going to default. I need to find something to sell. Sarah put the calibration tool down. She looked at him for a long time in the way that people who had been around long enough to know what the world actually cost looked at someone who had just started calculating it. Sit down, Davo. He sat on the edge of the examination bench. The unit from Ring 7, she said. It's been decommissioned, stripped and recycled. You can't get the wear off a decommissioned shell. The Syndicate's recovery teams are very thorough. She crossed her arms. What you saw in the shard, that acceleration package, the way it moved, that wasn't standard issue compliance hardware. That was military-grade neural speedware, a Kinetica 7 spinal array, top tier. The kind of wear the Syndicate's frontline response units run when they're not using compliance shells. It's not on the black market because the Syndicate doesn't lose units equipped with it. Ever. How do you know what it was? Because I've seen the schematics. She met his eyes, and because I have one. The silence in the back room was very complete. I acquired it 6 months ago, Sarah said, her voice flat and factual in the way it got when she was discussing something she had decided to be honest about. Off a Ring 2 smuggler who'd pulled it from a supply transport. He wanted quick creds. I had quick creds. And now I have a Kinetica 7 spinal array sitting in my cold locker because I don't have a buyer who can handle the physiological profile. It requires a very specific nervous system architecture to run at full function. Most augmented humans hop out at partial integration. Seizure threshold becomes critical pretty fast. She paused. I've been testing candidates for months. None of them have the right architecture. Davo said, What does the right architecture look like? She was quiet. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the calibration tool, measuring. It looks like someone who grew up in low gravity with poor nutrition and suboptimal air recycling, she said slowly, whose nervous system developed under chronic low-level stress and compensated by running lean and redundant rather than thick and fast. Someone whose baseline response latency is already higher than average. Not because they're slow, but because their system learned to pre-buffer, to model before it acts. She tilted her head. I ran your architecture profile off the neural jack adapter 6 months ago when you first came in. You were here to buy the shard. You paid with a chip tap and the tap gave me a biometrics ping. I shouldn't have run it without consent. I'm telling you now. Davo was very still. What did you find? That you're the closest match I've ever seen for this particular array. She walked to the cold locker. And that if I put it in you, there is approximately a 70% chance it works perfectly and a 30% chance it kills you on the table. She opened the locker. Inside, packed in cryofoam, was a device about the size of a fist, lattice of silver-gray filament wound around a compressed neurojunction core. Even inert, it had a quality of coiled intention, like something that had learned to be very still and was waiting to stop. The other thing I need to tell you is that extended use of a Kinetica array at full function is correlated with a condition the Syndicate calls cascade dissociation. Human Ripper docs call it chrome sickness. The acceleration wear doesn't just speed your body up, it speeds your perception up. And if you use it too often for too long, the gap between what you're experiencing and what your baseline nervous system can process starts to widen. You start living in a speed the world can't keep up with. Eventually, you lose the ability to tell the difference between what's real and what you're modeling. She closed the locker. Most people who run this hardware for more than 18 months don't come back from that. What's the installation cost? Davo asked. Sarah's expression didn't change. For you right now, nothing. Because I need to know if it works. He looked at the locker. He thought about his mother's photograph above the cot, the burning sea, the colony light. He thought about Cress's hands shaking at the end of the shard. He thought about Cassin's smile, and the pay grade reduction and the scholarship, default and the loading corridors. Okay, he said. He woke up 4 hours later on the examination bench with a scar on his lower spine and a headache that felt like his skull had been repurposed. Sarah handed him a water and a set of calibration instructions and told him not to use it for 48 hours to let the interface nodes settle. She also told him not to tell anyone. She did not tell him what to do if the 30% happened. He suspected this was because there was nothing to do. He caught the transit back up to -6. He heated another cup of nutrient concentrate in the dark galley and sat at the small table and waited. His mother came home at 21:30. She was wearing her triage uniform, and she had a contusion above her right eyebrow that she hadn't had this morning, the yellow-green of something that had happened mid-shift and hadn't been tended because she was the one who did the tending. She looked at him for a moment with the kind of look that knew something had changed before it knew what. "You called me 6 times, she said, setting her bag down. "I saw the citation." She took a slow breath. "I know. I'm going to appeal it. The review takes 3 weeks. Scholarship payments are due in 8 days. She sat in the chair across from him. She looked tired in a way that was different from the tired she looked on an ordinary day. Deeper, like something structural rather than something accumulated. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hands were always warm. "She ran hot," she said, "which in the lower rings meant your insulation worked better than most." "I'm going to figure it out," she said. "I always figure it out." "I know. You don't have to look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're trying to memorize my face." He looked down at the table. She squeezed his hand once and then let go and pushed herself up and went to heat her own cup. He sat and listened to the sound of the station around them. The hum of the ring drive, the distant clatter of a maintenance drone on the outer hull, the wheeze of the air recycler in the corridor. And he thought that the world was very loud for something that felt so empty. 3 days later, on the transit from the academy back to -6, a syndicate security response team executed a high-speed intercept of a smuggled cargo vehicle in the transit corridor on Ring 4. The cargo vehicle was running without proper transponder codes, and the response team had authorization for forced stop, which in practice meant they blew out the vehicle's drive axle with a crowd suppression charge. The vehicle, moving at transit speed, lost control and swept across 2 lanes and hit the railing and hit the wall and hit the public transit platform where Davo's mother was waiting for the Ring 3 connection after a double shift. He wasn't there. He found out via a medical alert notification on his personal feed. Martinez Mira. Trauma registered, Ring 4 transit platform, escalation code 3, and he came down on the first available transit and ran the last quarter ring, on foot, and found her on the platform being attended to by 2 people who had stopped from the crowd. Neither of them medics, both of them doing their best with what they had, which was not much. She was breathing, she was conscious. Her left leg was badly broken, the bone showing through the fabric of her triage trousers, and there was blood on the side of her face, and she was holding very still in the way that people held still when they were being very careful with their own pain. He knelt beside her. He took her hand. She looked at him and she said, with extraordinary calm, "You need to call the medical unit." He was already calling. He was calling Ring 3's triage line. He was calling the emergency medical rapid response. He was calling every number he had. And while he called, a syndicate trauma response vessel, white and sleek and built for speed, descended from the upper transit lanes and hung in the air above the platform, and 2 of its crew members stepped out in full biometric kit and walked toward them with their scanners already running. Davo watched them scan his mother. He watched them scan her chip. He watched one of the crew members look at the readout and then look at the other and say something with the flat body language of a decision already made. Then they walked to the vehicle that had lost control and they began scanning the personnel in that vehicle, who were syndicate contractors and held Tier 2 chips. And Davo understood what was happening before he was fully able to believe it. He stood up. "She needs, sir, please remain calm." The crew member was polite. They were always polite. Politeness was very efficient. "We are attending to priority cases based on triage protocol. Her leg is broken. She's bleeding from her head. She works in your medical facility on Ring 3. Trig protocol is based on access chip tier, sir. This ensures optimal resource allocation across the station." The crew member had already turned back to the contractor vehicle. "Emergency public services have been notified. Ground-level medical assistance is en route." The ground-level medical assistance arrived 22 minutes later. By then, Davo had stripped off his jacket and tied it around his mother's leg, above the break to slow the blood loss, which was something he knew how to do because his mother had shown him when he was 8 years old in case of emergency. By then, the syndicate trauma vessel had extracted the injured contractors and was already gone, back to whatever ring it served. By then, 3 other people from the platform crowd had stopped to help, and they were good people, kind people, people doing their best with no training and no equipment. His mother held his hand through all of it. When the ground medical team finally loaded her onto a transport, she squeezed his fingers once and said, quietly, so that only he could hear, "It's all right." It was not all right. She made it through surgery. The break was severe and required a synthetic bone scaffold, and the procedure took 4 hours, and afterward she was in recovery. and couldn't receive visitors until morning. Davo sat in the waiting area of the -6 public medical unit, a different facility, a lesser facility, a facility that smelled of old antiseptic and had chairs bolted to the floor in rows. And he stared at his hands in the blue light of the overhead panels. His mother's blood was still on his jacket. He thought about the crew member's face, the polite face, the face that said triage protocol is based on access chip tier, sir, as though this were a natural law rather than a choice someone had made and continued to make because it benefited them to do so. He stayed at the medical unit until 03 heard. Then he went home. He could not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at the photograph above the cot. His mother's colony shore, the sea that burned with light, and he thought, with a clarity that felt very clean and very cold, that he had exactly two choices: find a way to be more useful to the machine, or find a way to break it. The next morning, Casson found him in the corridor between classes. "Heard about your mother," Casson said. "Shame about the platform. Ring 4 transit is always." He never finished the sentence. Davo hit him with the Kinetica 7 at 30% activation. He didn't even know he'd triggered it. It just happened. The world going blue-tinted and slow around him. Every particle of dust hanging in the corridor air like a question mark. And in the long syrup of it, he watched Casson's fist come at him. The same aggressive swipe he'd been making for 2 years, and Davo wasn't there when it arrived. He moved 2 feet left in the time it took Casson's arm to extend, and then he hit Casson once, precisely in the center of his perfect chest. Casson hit the corridor wall hard enough to crack the composite panel. He slid down it. He sat on the floor looking up with an expression that Davo had never seen on his face before. The specific expression of a person who has just understood, for the first time, that the world might not be shaped the way they assumed. Davo stood over him. The world came back to speed. The blue tint faded. "My mother," Davo said, "has never let you down." He walked out of the academy building and didn't go back. The woman's name was Luce. He met her the same night he walked out, or more accurately, she picked his pocket on the -7 transit platform, and he noticed and chased her, and she led him on a 7-minute sprint through 3 maintenance corridors and 2 freight lifts before doubling back and ending up ahead of him with a mono wire stretched between her fingers and an expression that was not hostile so much as professionally evaluative. "You're fast," she said. "You have my wallet. I have a lot of people's wallets. Why specifically are you the one who caught up?" She looked at him, at the way he was breathing, which was barely, even after 7 minutes at full sprint. "What are you running?" he told her. He wasn't sure why. She was a stranger and a thief, and the monowire was still live between her fingers. But the question had been direct and specific, and she was looking at him like the question actually mattered, like the answer was something she was genuinely interested in knowing, and no one had looked at him like that in a long time. She put the wire away. She handed back his wallet. She said, "Come with me. I want to show you something." She led him to Ring 3's outer maintenance corridor, where a crew of people were running a covert data extraction from a syndicate cargo manifest terminal. There were 5 of them: a broad man in a long coat who moved like he was built out of load-bearing materials, a wiry woman with subdermal interface tracks running up her arms, a young man who seemed to be in charge of hauling things quickly, and a 4th person running overwatch from a high-traffic vent above the platform. Luce moved among them with the ease of someone who had been doing this for a long time and was very good at it. She had silver hair and pale eyes, and she moved quietly, precisely, like someone who understood space well enough not to waste any of it. The broad man's name was Cargo. He looked at Davo the way Cargo looked at everything, with a slow, complete attention, as though he were assessing load capacity. "She says you ran a Kinetica array," Cargo said, "that you chased her down from a standing start. She picked my pocket. She picks everybody's pocket. It's a test." He crossed his arms. The coat fell around him like a small private structure. "What ring are you from?" "-6. Academy, until today." Cargo looked at him a long time. Then he said, "You know what we are? You're edge runners." The word was old slang, lower ring vocabulary for the crew operators who lived in the margin between the syndicate's law and the nothing below it. They ran extraction jobs and cargo interceptions and information theft for clients who needed things done without syndicate fingerprints. They were not heroic. They were not villains. They were people who had looked at the machine and decided that since they were going to get ground up in it anyway, they might as well get paid for it. "We are," Cargo said, "and I'm not in the habit of recruiting academy kids who've had their wear installed in the past 48 hours. I'm not asking you to recruit me. I'm asking for a job. Cargo looked at Luce. Luce shrugged in the way that meant she'd already made up her mind and was waiting for him to catch up. He looked back at Davo and he said, "One run. Probationary. You follow orders or you're done. You compromise the crew and whatever you're running won't help you." He held out his hand. "Welcome to the edge." His mother came out of recovery 4 days later. She came home to the -6 apartment and lay on the cot and Davo sat with her, and he did not tell her about the academy or Casson or Cargo's crew. He told her about a part-time systems contract he'd picked up, which was not entirely false, since Cargo's runs paid in creds and required systems knowledge. And he brought her food from the galley, and he watched her sleep, and he thought about how small she looked, how the synthetic scaffold in her leg made a faint asymmetry in the shape of her under the blanket. She woke at one point and found him still sitting there, and she looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "You're going to be okay," she said. "Not a question. I know. I'm not worried about the money." She said it with a conviction that he recognized as real, even knowing it wasn't entirely honest. "I'm worried about you making choices because of the money, Mom. There's a difference between surviving and losing yourself to survive." Her voice was quiet. The recycler hummed. "I've seen it happen to good people. You make one compromise, because you have to, and then the next one is a little easier, and after a while you can't remember what you used to be before the compromises." She paused. "I don't want that for you." He looked at the photograph, the burning sea. "What if the compromises are worth something?" he said. "What if they make things better?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Then you remember what better looks like. You keep that clear in your head. You don't let the method become the point." She fell asleep again with her hand in his. He sat there until the lights cycled to night mode and the station went quiet around them, and he thought about the burning sea and whether he could get there and whether getting there would mean anything by the time he did. He ran with Cargo's crew for 3 months. He learned faster than they expected him to. This was partly because the Kinetica 7 made certain aspects of operational work, reading a room, tracking multiple variables, exiting a situation before it became a situation, significantly easier than they were for baseline humans, and partly because Davo had spent 2 years in an academy built on the premise that information was the architecture of power, and he had absorbed that premise even as he resented its application. Luce was his trainer for the first month. She was a net runner, a neural interface operator who could slip into syndicate data networks through the station's unlicensed access nodes and pull information with a speed and precision that made conventional data theft look like breaking a window with a brick. She had a way of teaching that was not exactly teaching. She would do a thing, and then look at him, and he would understand what she had done and why, and then she would do something harder and look at him again. She didn't explain things unless he specifically asked. When he asked, her explanations were very good. She was also one of the most alone people he had ever met. Not lonely, alone, which was different. She had a quality of self-containment that made her seem like a complete unit, a closed system. She was part of the crew in every practical sense, but she kept the margins of herself to herself. She was careful with Davo in the way that people were careful with something they were not yet sure how to handle. He liked her. He wasn't sure how to tell her he liked her without it coming out wrong. So for the first month he said nothing and concentrated on the work. The third crew member he got to know was Pill, a compact, wiry man who moved with the frantic economy of someone who had been small his whole life and had decided early on that the best defense against a large world was speed. He ran cargo. He drove vehicles that were not supposed to be driven. He had a loud laugh and a habit of naming all the machinery he worked with as though it were a pet. And he talked to the vehicles while he drove them in a low, continuous monologue that Davo initially found bizarre and came to find quietly reassuring. Pill had been with Cargo since before Luce, which made him the longest-serving crew member, and he treated this seniority as something that entitled him to comment freely on everything, which he did, constantly, with remarkable good humor. Falco was different. Falco was quiet in the same way that Luce was quiet, from self-sufficiency rather than reserve, and he was the best driver Davo had ever seen and possibly the best driver anyone on Nocturne had ever seen. He had an intuition for transit lane behavior that seemed to extend in front of and behind the vehicles simultaneously, like he was reading the whole corridor as a single flowing system and locating himself within it in real time. He didn't talk much. He had no opinions about the jobs themselves. only about routing and approach vectors and the precise window of transit time in which a given operation had to be completed. He was very rarely wrong about any of these. Together they were strange and mismatched and argued constantly about minor operational decisions in the way that people argued when they actually trusted each other enough to disagree out loud. Davo had not had that. The academy had been a competition and the lower rings had been a survival problem, and neither of those structures produced the kind of friction that was actually warmth. He didn't have a word for what Cargo's crew was. He just kept showing up. The work was good. Not morally good. He had no illusions about what they were, what they did, what the line between them and the people they robbed was and wasn't. But good in the sense of being real, of having tangible dimensions and outcomes, of being something he was genuinely capable of. He ran corridor intercepts and data pulls, and twice he used the Kinetica 7 in direct action situations, once against a syndicate patrol unit and once against a rival crew trying to claim the same cargo, and each time he came through clean. The first time he activated it in a real fight, he didn't entirely control it. It went to 60% before he'd consciously decided to trigger it, and the world went blue and enormous around him, and he stood in the middle of a firefight, watching plasma charges arc through the corridor air, like slow orange fish, while 3 syndicate patrol units tried to track him and couldn't. He moved between them and disabled the first unit's weapon arm at its mounting joint, which was a very specific and precise bit of disassembly that he'd identified in the blue world as the most efficient approach. And the second and third units were still turning when he hit each of them in a different joint socket, and they all went down without a shot fired. Afterward, Cargo looked at him for a long moment and said, "That's what it does, is it?" "At 60%, Davo said. "Don't tell me what it does at full load." "I don't want to be disappointed with the rest of you." Pill laughed so hard he had to sit down. Each time. Afterward, he sat with Sarah and let her check the neural interface, and she told him the integration was stable, and that his chrome sickness risk markers were still in the safe range, and that he needed to make sure he was eating and sleeping. He ate. He slept. He went home and watched his mother watch the news feeds before she fell asleep on the couch. The visits home began to feel like 2 worlds rubbing against each other, without quite touching. The galley and the couch and the recycler's wheeze and his mother's shoes, these things had not changed. He had changed. He sat across from her and drank nutrient concentrate, and he was the same person, and not the same person in a way that had no clean description. He did not tell her about the fight in the Ring 4 corridor or the run on the logistics depot or Pill's habit of humming a low tuneless sound when he was concentrating on something dangerous. He told her the systems contract was going well. She told him the appeal on her citation had been resolved in her favor. They were both, in their different ways, not lying. In the 4th month, Cargo let him buy in. The buy-in was not formal. There were no contracts in the edgerunner trade. It was simply that one evening after a successful run, Cargo handed him a flask of something that tasted like it had been synthesized in a machine and said, "Your crew now," and passed the flask around, and everyone drank, and that was that. He was one of them. He belonged somewhere. He hadn't known how much he'd needed that until it happened. It was Luce who told him about the moon, on a night when the job had gone long, and they were waiting in a maintenance shaft for a security rotation to pass, and the station's outer ring was visible through a grill. The slow wheel of Nocturne's structural ring, and beyond it the colony that the syndicate called the outer habitation block, but that the lower rings called the moon, because it was the only thing in sight that wasn't the station. A place where the syndicate's grip was reportedly less total, where the air was real air and the gravity was stable, and you could go outside and see the star field without a viewport mediating it. "I want to go there," Luce said. She was watching the rotation through the grill with the patient attention she gave to things she had already decided about, not as a run, not as transit, just to be there, to stop. "Stop isn't really your mode," Davo said. She almost smiled. It did things to her face. "No, but I'd like to try." She was quiet for a moment. "When I was running in the syndicate's network, before I met Cargo's crew, I found coordinates for an approach vector. A private transit route that bypasses the syndicate checkpoint at Ring 1. It's technically accessible. It's not cheap, but if you had enough creds." "How much?" she told him. It was a number that was not impossible. It was a number that required several months of good runs and a complete absence of bad luck and the kind of operational discipline that was very hard to maintain in a trade that was by definition unpredictable. But it was not impossible. You'd need me to come with you, he said, to get to the checkpoint. I know. Is that why you're telling me? She thought about this. She was always honest when she thought about things before she answered them. Partly, she said, and partly because I think you want to go somewhere too. And I think you want someone to go with. She looked at him. Her pale eyes were very direct. I think you've a photograph of a place you've never been and you want to know if it's real. He said nothing. The security rotation cycled on the other side of the grill. Deal, he said. He did not know that the deal had already been noticed. The syndicate had a division called the Oversight Directorate. Its function was to monitor edgerunner activity in Nocturne's lower rings, not to suppress it entirely, since edgerunner crews served a useful regulatory function in the station's underground economy, but to ensure that it never grew large enough or competent enough to constitute a genuine operational threat. The Directorate employed a fixer, a translator-class agent named Faradin, who ran a stable of edgerunner contacts across the lower rings. Faradin's function was to know who was doing what and to ensure the syndicate always had a lever. Faradin had noticed Davo in the third month. Davo was not subtle. The Kinetica 7 made him distinctive in a way that was very hard to hide, because there were very few ways to move like that, and only one of them was neural acceleration. Faradin had run a check. The check had returned Davo's biometric profile and his academy background, and his mother's employment record and 3 nodes back in a data chain that Davo did not know existed. Sarah's black market transaction 6 months ago. Faradin sat on this information for a while because information was an investment, and you didn't redeem it too early. He waited until Cargo's crew began work on a job that the syndicate cared about, a data extraction from a classified logistics terminal in Ring 2, connected to Syndicate Directorate Alpha, and then Faradin made his move. He moved on Luce first because Luce was the most valuable piece, and because she was, uniquely among Cargo's crew, still carrying something that could be used. She had been inside Syndicate network territory that was not supposed to be accessible, and she had seen things in there that were not supposed to be seen. The Syndicate wanted to know how deep the exposure was. They wanted to extract the data she carried, and, more importantly, they wanted to understand the access vector she had found so they could close it. They took her on a Thursday when she was running a solo access job on Ring 5. She didn't come back. Davo found out from Falco, their transit driver, a laconic man who noticed things as a professional habit, who had been monitoring the Ring 5 access nodes, and had watched the Syndicate response team arrive and watched them leave with a passenger, and had put the pieces together with the efficiency of someone who had survived a long time by reading rooms correctly. He called Davo from a transit platform and said, very simply, they have Luce, Faradin's people. I think they're taking her to Directorate Alpha processing. Cargo heard this and went quiet in the way he went quiet when he was doing mathematics. Then he said, we don't go up against Directorate Alpha. She's crew, Davo said. She's one person. Directorate Alpha is a full Syndicate operational facility with response capacity we cannot match. Davo looked at him. She's one person. Cargo didn't answer immediately. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and his jaw moved slightly, and then he looked at Davo and he said, very carefully, I know what she is to you, and I know what you're prepared to do about it. I'm not going to tell you not to. I'm just telling you the mathematics. He paused. And I'm telling you that if you're going, I'm going with you. What happened next did not go the way any of them planned, because things that depended on surviving contact with a Syndicate operational facility never went the way anyone planned. They went in on the Ring 2 access approach, Falco driving, Cargo and Davo running front contact, the rest of the crew in support positions. And they made it to the 3rd security tier before the response units closed on them. Cargo took fire from a corridor deployment, and he took more of it than he should have, which in retrospect was because he'd already been running too much augmentation too often, and his chrome sickness tolerance had been deteriorating for weeks, and he was compensating with stimulants that taxed the integration, and he hadn't told any of them. He held the corridor for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a very long time to hold a corridor against a Syndicate response unit. Davo got Lusa out in 3.5. He found her in a processing bay on the 4th tier, restrained, neurally muted with a suppression jack, but conscious and physically intact. And when he pulled the jack, she came back fast, her pale eyes sharp and immediate. No wasted time on disorientation. She looked at him once and said, I told you not to come. I meant to. They ran. The Kinetica 7 went to full activation and the corridor turned blue and slow, and Davo moved through it, pulling Luce by the hand, and for a moment, a long blue syrup slow moment. The world was perfectly clear and simple. There was his hand and her hand in the corridor and the objective, which was the exit, and everything else was background. Then they were through the security tier and on the transit approach, and Falco had the vehicle running, and Davo and Lusa threw themselves in and the door sealed, and Falco drove like a man conducting a controlled demolition, and behind them the facility's response units were already in pursuit. Cargo was not in the vehicle. They got 2 rings away before the feed came through on the crew channel. Cargo's channel, his voice, ragged and strange with something that might have been effort, or might have been the chrome sickness finally having its say, telling them he was in the maintenance sub-level holding the response unit's secondary deployment, that he had calculated the mathematics, and the mathematics said he was the constraint variable, that he was removing himself from the equation. Keep running, Cargo said. The channel had feedback in it, the kind of feedback that came from a high-power impact event nearby. That's the whole job. You know how to do it. He said David's name, not Davo. David, the full name that no one used, the name his mother had given him, the name that sounded like something official. And then the channel went to static. Davo sat in the back of the transit vehicle, and he stared at the floor, and he felt the static, where Cargo's voice had been the way you felt the absence of a sound you'd gotten used to. Not like silence exactly, but like a frequency you'd stopped noticing until it wasn't there. Luce put her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything. She was very good at knowing when there was nothing to say. He buried it. He put it somewhere that had good walls, and he went back to work because that was what Cargo had told him to do, and because the alternative was sitting still, and he did not know how to be still anymore. 6 months passed. He got more augmentation. He had to. The Kinetica 7's performance ceiling was limited by its integration with his baseline hardware, and raising that ceiling required supplemental neural processing capacity. He got a second junction cluster above the primary spinal array, and a targeting assist package, and a physical load distribution system that let him move mass that a baseline human couldn't. Sarah did the installations in the laundry room at -8, and each time she checked his chrome sickness markers, and each time they were slightly higher than the time before, creeping upward in the way that things crept upward when you were pretending not to watch them. He led the crew now. He hadn't announced it or claimed it. It had simply become true by force of continuity. He was the one making the calls, the one they looked to, the one who stood between the crew and whatever the situation was doing. He was good at it. He understood the architecture of bad situations in a way that made him fast at redesigning them, and the Kinetica 7 made him faster still. They ran better under him than they had before, and he was not proud of this, but because being proud of it meant thinking about why they needed a better leader, and he still didn't like to think about that for too long. He visited his mother every other week. She had recovered from the leg surgery and was back to work, and the pay grade review had concluded, eventually, with no finding. Someone in Ring 3 administration had quietly buried the citation, which he suspected had something to do with Faradon's people moving information around the station the way Faradon's people always did, making things happen that served their purposes. He didn't trust it. He told his mother the scholarship had been handled through the systems contract. She looked at him for a long time when he said this, and then she nodded and did not ask follow-up questions, which was a form of love that he was beginning to understand. "You've changed," she said on one of those visits. He was sitting across from her at the galley table, and she was watching him with the particular attention she reserved for things she was worried about. "For the better or worse? I can't tell yet." She reached over and tucked something at his collar, a reflex, a ghost gesture from when he was small, and she was always adjusting something on him because he was always getting something wrong. "You're faster. You think faster. Your eyes move differently." She paused. "Are you eating?" Sarah checks that. Sarah is a ripper doc, not your mother. She acts like one. Mira almost smiled. "Good, then I have backup." She sat back. "Davo, whatever you're doing, whatever the job is." She held his eyes. "Don't disappear on me. I need you to still be in there when all of this is over." He didn't tell her that he wasn't sure what over looked like. He said he was in there. He said he was fine. He believed it mostly. Faradon made his real move in the 7th month. He had been, it turned out, the architect of the entire Luce situation. Not acting for director at Alpha, but for a private syndicate faction that wanted the network access. Vector she'd found, a back channel into a data resource that had value that was, according to the information Luce had pulled before they took her, large enough to warrant the kind of operation that did not care about collateral and did not require directorate authorization. Faradhan had been playing multiple accounts simultaneously, logging the Edgerunner monitoring data to Directorate Alpha to maintain his cover, while running the private job on the side and collecting from both directions. Kiwi found this out. Kiwi was the wiry woman with the subdermal tracks who had been with Cargo's crew longer than anyone else. A data analyst, not a netrunner, but very good at reading the shape of information flows from the outside. She came to Davo with the evidence package and the name and the additional information that Faradhan had been in contact with Cargo's crew from the beginning and had been feeding Directorate Alpha their movements in exchange for operational latitude in the lower rings. She also told him that Faradhan had a private arrangement with Directorate Alpha's principal enforcer, the one they called Shatterform. Shatterform was a name that moved through the lower rings the way certain names moved, quietly, with weight, the way really heavy things moved. It was allegedly the Syndicate's senior response asset, a full conversion unit, meaning that whatever had originally inhabited the physical chassis had long since been subsumed by augmentation to the point of categorical ambiguity. It was not a compliant shell. It was something that had started as one thing and chosen to become another, or had been made to choose. The Syndicate used it for high-value target elimination. It had never been stopped by anything the lower rings could field. Davo looked at the evidence package for a long time. "How good is this information?" he asked Kiwi. "Good enough to act on," she said. "Not good enough to guarantee anything. Does Faradhan know you have it?" She looked at him steadily. "He will. I can't hold this longer than 2 days before the information architecture changes enough to cover the trail." She paused. "There's one more thing." She pulled up a secondary file. "The reason Faradhan wants the network vector Luce found. It's not data. It's access to a supply chain. A Syndicate hardware supply chain that includes, among other things, bulk Kinetica 7 arrays earmarked for a new frontline response program." She met his eyes. "They're not building compliance shells anymore. They're building something new. Something they can run the acceleration wear in at higher tolerance ranges because it won't be running it in anything human." He sat with that for a moment. "If that program deploys," she said, "the lower rings stop being a problem they manage. They become a problem they solve." Davo thought of Cress's hands shaking at the end of the shard. He thought of his mother on the platform, holding still with her own pain. He thought of Cargo's voice on the channel going static. He thought of Luce at the grill, watching the moon through the maintenance vent, saying, "I think you want to go somewhere too." He called Falco. He called Luce. He told Kiwi to hold the information as long as she could, and to get to a safe position when she couldn't hold it anymore. He went to Sarah. She looked at him when he walked through the laundry room's rear entrance, and she saw his face, and she said, without him having to say it first, "You're going to do something that puts the whole array under full load. I need the immunosuppressant protocol, everything you have." Sarah was quiet for a very long time. She was looking at his chrome sickness markers on her diagnostic tablet, which she'd pulled up automatically, the way she always did when he came in. She was very still. "If I give you the full protocol," she said, "and you run full load with the whole augmentation stack in a sustained engagement scenario, Davo, you have maybe one shot at this. The cascade risk at these marker levels with full load activation. I know, I'm not sure you do." "Sarah," he held her eyes. "I know." She held the tablet. She looked at him with the expression of a person who has had a conversation like this before and knows what it means. Then she went to the cabinet. She prepared the protocol. While she worked, she talked, steadily, about maintenance intervals and dosing sequence and warning signs to watch for, talking the way people talked when the talking was the only thing they had left to give. He listened to all of it. He memorized it. When she was done, she pressed the prepared doses into his hands, and she held his hands for a moment, and she said, "You are the most interesting architecture I have ever seen. Whatever's on the other side of this, you made it work." He nodded. He couldn't say much. "Tell Lucy it was worth it, if you get the chance." He left. They moved on Faradhan's operation that night, Falco driving, Luce running data overwatch from a mobile access point, Davo moving up the transit rings with his full augmentation stack prepped and the first dose of the immunosuppressant taken, and the world sharpening around him the way it sharpened when the Kinetica 7 was primed. The chrome sickness markers were in a range Sarah had described as critical. He could feel it at the edges. A slight disconnection between what he intended and what he perceived. A microsecond of delay in his own proprioception. He put it in a box and closed the box. Kiwi had given them Faradon's extraction route. He was moving Luce's network access data to a Directorate Alpha transfer facility in Ring 1. The top ring, the Syndicate's administrative crown, where the air was clean and the ceilings were high, and the people who made decisions about the lower rings did so in offices with real windows. Faradon was traveling by private AV with a security package that was significant but manageable. What was not manageable was that Directorate Alpha had been monitoring the situation and had activated Shatterform as a precautionary asset. They hit the AV on the Ring 2 approach. Falco cut its transit lane with a stolen transponder signal, Luce dropped its navigation uplink, and Davo came in through the vehicle roof, with the acceleration stack running at 70%. And he went through Faradon's security package, the way a kinetic round went through paper. Not because the security package was weak, but because at 70% the Kinetica 7 made the interval between their reactions and his actions so small as to be effectively non-existent. He found Faradon in the rear compartment, and he held him against the vehicle wall with the casual confidence of a person who has made a large number of extremely precise decisions in a very short time, and he said, "Where's Luce's extraction data?" Faradon told him. The data was encoded on a physical carrier in Faradon's coat. Davo took it. He looked at Faradon for a moment, and he thought about Cargo's static and Mira's leg, and the 4 workers kneeling in the Ring 7 corridor, and the polite face of the trauma team crew member, and all the things that had led here, in a chain of consequences as long as the station itself. He didn't do anything with that thought. He left Faradon breathing, and he dropped from the AV to the transit platform, and he moved. Shatterform was already there. He had been briefed on it. The briefing was full conversion syndicate asset, running military-grade augmentation stack, operational history, that included every response scenario that the Directorate considered high risk. And he had thought he understood what that meant. He had not understood what it meant. Shatterform was not large in the way that implied slowness. It was large in the way that implied that someone had decided the usual constraints on size were not a concern and had built accordingly. It stood in the transit corridor with a stillness that was the stillness of something that didn't need to move yet. A stillness that was, itself, a kind of threat. It looked at him. It looked at him the way a very specific kind of intelligence looked at things, not with hostility, but with an assessment that was deeply incurious about the result, the way an expert looked at an entry-level problem. It said, David Martinez, Kinetica 7 integration, secondary processing cluster, load distribution system, 3rd generation chrome sickness markers in the critical range. Its translation hardware was the Syndicate's standard pattern, clean, vowel perfect. You are very far from where you started. Davo took the 2nd immunosuppressant dose. He felt it hit his bloodstream, a chemical tightening across the top of his skull. The chrome sickness pressure retreating a half step behind the wall the suppressant threw up. It wouldn't hold. He knew it wouldn't hold, but it bought him what he needed. So are you, he said, and he activated the Kinetica 7 to full load. The world went blue and slow and vast, and he ran. He had never run it at full load before. Sarah had warned him against it in every consultation. In the calibration drills he had done at 80%, 90%, and the world at those levels was already a strange country. Movement turned to physics, physics turned to geometry. Every action a line he drew through space. At full load it was something else. It was the world turned to a drawing of itself, a blueprint with all the tolerances shown, and he moved through it with a precision that was not exactly human and not exactly anything else. Something in the margin between what he'd been and what the hardware wanted to make him. Shatterform was fast, faster than any compliance shell, fast enough that even in Davo's blue world it registered as a present threat rather than a solved variable. It moved on him from the left, and he translated right, and the impact clipped his shoulder instead of taking his head, and the force of it spun him into the corridor wall hard enough to dent the composite paneling. The dent was about 40 centimeters deep. He registered this as data, the force required to create that dent versus the force he'd absorbed, the differential. What his distribution hardware had done with it. He turned and moved and hit Shatterform in the primary actuator joint of its right arm with everything he had and felt the joint give, a partial fracture, the hydraulic seal compromised. Shatterform staggered half a step. 1/2 step in the blue world was a geological event. They went at each other in the corridor for what the blue world measured as approximately 11 minutes. In real time, the suppressant told him it was closer to 3.5. The corridor was being destroyed around them, panels cracked, conduits ruptured, transit lighting flickering and failing section by section as their fight moved through the infrastructure like a fire through dry material. Davo put the monowire to work on Shatterform's sensor cluster, carving at the array housing, looking for the interface junction that Luce had identified in the briefing as the unit's vulnerability window. He got within 2 centimeters of it twice, and Shatterform drove him back both times. The chrome sickness was there, right there, a pressure at the back of his perception, a voice saying, "This is too much, this is the edge. Past this point you are not coming back the way you went in." He heard his mother's voice, not her actual voice, a construction, the chrome sickness pulling memory and layering it over the present, which was what it did in the late stages. He heard her saying, "Don't disappear on me, I need you to still be in there." And he held that like a handhold on a surface that was trying to become something else. He thought of Pill's laugh in the back of Falco's vehicle. He thought of Cargo's hand on his shoulder on the night he'd bought in. That brief firm grip that meant something he'd never been told in words. He thought of Luce at the maintenance vent, the colony ring in the middle distance, turning, her pale eyes and her certainty, and the deal they'd made in the security shaft while the rotation cycled around them. He fought. He fought the way a person fought who had made a decision about what they were for. Not to win, not to survive, but to make the specific outcome happen. That was the whole point. He needed Shatterform occupied. He needed Falco to get Luce clear. He needed 4 minutes the way Cargo had needed 4 minutes, and he understood now, viscerally, with his whole body and its borrowed speed, what Cargo had felt holding that corridor, what it had cost, what it had meant. He thought of the way Cargo had said, "Keep running," the specific cadence of it, the way the words had come out, already past their own grief. He thought of Pill, who was gone now too, lost on a run in the 5th month that went wrong in the way runs went wrong, quickly and without warning and with no one to be angry at except the general architecture of a universe that didn't care. He thought of all of them. He thought of what it meant to be the one still running when so many others had stopped. He ran the Kinetica 7 at full load for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He knew the exact figure because the interface logged it, and the chrome sickness made time extremely legible in those late stages, each second arriving with its own distinct shape. Shatterform took him apart by degrees. That was the honest description. It was methodical and it was expert, and the chrome sickness was amplifying his pain response into something that had its own geometry now, its own blue world architecture. He broke 2 of Shatterform's hydraulic actuators. He cracked its primary sensor array. He drove the mono-wire into the secondary interface cluster at the base of its chassis twice, and the second time, something important came loose. Inside it, he heard it in the change of its movement, a slight asynchrony, the hydraulic signal lagging behind the motor intent. None of it stopped it. It was built to absorb, but it did not stop him either. 4 minutes. 4 minutes and Falco had the vehicle running and Luce was in it. 4 minutes and the access data was with them. 4 minutes and the route to the colony ring's bypass vector was encoded in Luce's memory, where Furadon's people and the Directorate and Shatter. Form could not follow because memory was the one thing that could not be extracted without consent. He heard Luce's voice on the crew channel. Not a question. She already knew the mathematics. David. He had never told her his full name. Cargo must have. "Go," he said. His voice was steady. He was surprised by that. "Take the route. Don't wait." A pause on the channel. A pause that had everything in it. "I'll wait for you there," she said. "Not I'll wait for you here. There, the colony ring, the moon, the place where you could stop." He thought, good. He thought, okay. He thought of the photograph above his mother's cot, the burning sea, the colony light. Shatterform hit him for the last time, and he hit the platform, and he was on the floor, and the blue world was fading at the edges because the immunosuppressant protocol was exhausted, and the chrome sickness was at the wall, and the wall was giving. He looked up at the ceiling of Ring 2's transit corridor, the high syndicate ceiling, the clean syndicate ceiling, and he thought, this is a long way from -6. Shatterform stood over him. It looked down at him with its assessment expression, the incurious expert expression. "You held longer than the calculation projected," it said. "There is a utilization opportunity. Full conversion protocol. Your architecture is valuable." He thought about Cress, sitting on the edge of a bunk with shaking hands. He thought about the choice to record, to keep it honest. No, Davo said. He said it very clearly. He wanted it in the record. Shatterform processed this. There was a moment, a very brief moment, in which its sensor array, damaged by the fight, oriented on him with the particular attention of a thing that had not expected the word. Then it raised its arm. Then the transit platform's emergency suppression system activated. A full-ring suppression discharge, the kind reserved for cyberpsychosis incidents, the highest order response nocturne civilian infrastructure, triggered by a network command issued from a mobile access point on Ring 3 Luce's access point, which she had not left, because she had not gone. The discharge hit Shatterform's damaged sensor array and hit its primary motor control interface and hit the already cracked hydraulic actuators, and the combination was exactly what a Syndicate operational assets designers had failed to account for, because they had never had to design for the possibility that a netrunner with access to Ring 3's emergency infrastructure would decide to stay. Shatterform went down, not destroyed, not permanently. The Syndicate would recover it and rebuild it and send it somewhere else to do what it did. But down for long enough. Davo lay on the platform. The chrome sickness was very loud now. He had the impression that the walls were breathing and that the light was doing something it had not been doing before. But he held on to the handhold his mother's voice had given him, and he held on to it, and the walls stopped. Breathing and the light settled. Falco was there. He didn't know exactly when Falco had come back for him, but Falco was there, pulling him up with the wordless efficiency of a man who made his living showing up where he was needed and getting things done quickly. Davo let himself be pulled. He sat in the vehicle and he pressed his back against the seat, and the transit moved beneath them like the station was, still a place where things could happen. Luce, he said. Waiting at the Ring 1 bypass, Falco said. She wants me to tell you she's sorry for not leaving when you told her. Davo considered this. He found he could not bring himself to be angry about it. He found he was something else entirely. They met her at the bypass approach. She was standing at the transit platform with the mobile access kit under one arm, and her pale eyes were doing what they did when she had made a decision she was not going to unmake, which was to be very direct. She looked at him, at the damage and the chrome sickness markers which were presumably visible in his posture and his eyes, and she said nothing about any of it. She walked up, and she put her hand on the side of his face, and she held it there for a moment, and he pressed into it and breathed. The route is clear, she said. Falco checked it. We can go tonight. My mother, he said. I know. Say goodbye first. He went to -6. It was very late. His mother was asleep on the couch, still dressed, one shoe off and one shoe on, the news feed running silently on the screen. He sat beside her for a long time. He looked at the photograph above the cot, the burning sea, the colony light. His mother had put it there so she could see it every morning when she woke up. So she knew what it looked like. So she didn't forget. He took the photograph off the wall. He held it for a moment. He put it in his pocket. He thought about what she had said about method and point. Don't let the method become the point. He had been running so long, running the Kinetica 7, running the jobs, running from the thing that Cargo's silence had left in him, that he had stopped being able to tell where the running ended, and he began. He sat in the blue light of the news feed, and he breathed, and he tried to locate himself. He was here, -6, the galley and the couch, and the recycler in the corridor, his mother's warm presence on the couch beside him, radiating her perpetual heat. The photograph, the burning sea. He was here. He touched her shoulder. She woke slowly, the way tired people woke, surfacing through layers. She looked at him, and her face did what it did when it was worried and trying not to show it. Are you all right? She said. I'm okay. He looked at her. He held her eyes. Mom, I'm going to the colony ring. I'm taking Luce. He paused. I've left you Faradon's data. There's enough in it to go to the Ring 3 Administrative Council with a complaint against the Directorate, enough to initiate a review. I know it's not fast, and I know it doesn't feel like enough, but it's what I have. She was very quiet. She looked at him the way she had on the night he'd come home from Sarah's the first time. Like she was measuring the difference between what she'd known this morning and what was sitting here now. You came to say goodbye, she said. I came to say I'm going somewhere, not goodbye. He reached out and took her hand the way she had taken his on the platform, palm over knuckles, warm, when it's safer, when the data has done what it's going to do. I'll come back or I'll send for you. I promise. She held his hand. She did not speak for a long time. He could hear the recycler in the corridor and the distant ring drive and the whole humming body of the station around them, like a heartbeat it had. never occurred to him to listen to until now. "I know you're not telling me everything," she said, quietly, without accusation. "No," he said. "I'm not. I know that too." She squeezed his hand. "I know who you are. I raised you. I know what you'll do to protect someone, and I know what you'll carry afterward." She looked at him in the dim blue light. "Carry it lightly. That's all I ask. Don't let it make you hard." He thought of Cargo, who had not been hard, who had been one of the most fully inhabited people Davo had ever known, dense with personality and warmth and the specific gravity of a person who knows what they're for. He thought of Pill's laugh. He thought of the 4 workers in Ring 7's corridor and Cress's hands that shook and kept recording anyway because some part of him had decided that honesty was the last thing a person could give the world when everything else had been taken. "I'll try," he said. "That's enough." She moved her hand from his to the side of his face for a moment, the same gesture she'd made when he was small, always adjusting something. "You were the best thing I did, David. The best thing by a long way." She dropped her hand. "Go." "That photograph," she said. She looked at his jacket pocket. "Where did you get it?" "I had it made. At the print kiosk on -7. It was the truth. He had gone that morning. He had the original in his pocket, and the copy was back on the wall above the cot. The same image, the same burning sea. She would wake tomorrow and look at it, and it would be there. She looked at the wall. She saw the copy. Something moved across her face that was not entirely sadness and not entirely something else. "It's a real place," she said. "The colony ring has that same light in the mornings. When it turns toward the star field, the angle makes it look like the sea is. The panels look like water." She pressed his hand. "When you get there, look at it in the morning." He squeezed back. He said, "I will." He left at 0200. Luce was waiting at the Ring 1 bypass approach. The transit route clear and the access codes entered, and Falco at the wheel with the engine running, and the kind of patience that was Falco's particular version of warmth. Davo got in and they drove up through the transit rings. Ring 1, the Syndicate's crown, the wide corridors and clean air and high ceilings, and through the bypass, and through the Syndicate's checkpoint that wasn't a checkpoint because Luce had made it not a checkpoint, and out the other side where the colony ring waited with its slow rotation and its air and its mornings that made the panels look like water. The chrome sickness pulled at the edges of him on the drive. He let Luce run the interface checks that Sarah had told him to run, the calibration sequence that measured where his markers were and what the recovery timeline looked like. The markers were bad. The recovery timeline was long. Neither of these things was a surprise. "Sarah says there's a recovery protocol," he said. "No full load activation for 6 months minimum. Progressive reintegration." He paused. "I might not be very useful for a while." "Good," Luce said. She had her head back against the seat, watching the corridor lights go past overhead. "I've been thinking about stopping for a while. You can stop with me." He thought about that. He thought about what stopping felt like. He couldn't quite remember. "Deal," he said. The colony ring resolved through the transit viewport, the outer hull peeling back on its approach to the dock, and beyond it the habitation spaces and the agriculture bays and the real air and the real gravity, and in the far window of the approach corridor, the star field stretching out in every direction like a fact the station had been keeping from them. It was not small, the star field. It was enormous, and it went on in every direction past any reasonable comprehension, and it did not care about transit chip tiers or syndicate compliance ordinances or the mathematics of who got to live and who got to be left on a platform. Luce sat up when she saw it. She pressed her palm against the viewport the way she had pressed her palm against the maintenance grill on -7 all those months ago. The same patient attention, the same quality of something decided rather than wished. The star field moved against her palm through the glass, and she watched it with an expression that was private enough that Davo looked away. Davo reached into his jacket and took out the photograph. The colony light hit it and the printed sea turned gold, and he thought of his mother on a couch in -6, one shoe on and one shoe off, the newsfeed running, the copy on the wall above the cot. He thought of Cargo's voice going static. He thought of Cress sitting with his shaking hands. He thought, "We are here, some of us." He put the photograph back in his pocket. The dock approached. Falco set them down with the particular economy of someone who had spent a long time landing in places he was not supposed to be, landing and had gotten very good at it. He cut the engine and sat with his hands on the controls for a moment and said, without turning, "Good run," which was as much as Falco ever said about anything, and it was the right amount. The hatch opened and the air came in. Different air. The kind that didn't have coolant in it, that moved like air was supposed to move, like it had origin and direction and hadn't been processed 17 times since it was last outside a wall. Davo breathed it and it hit the back of his throat and stayed there in a way that felt almost like a question. Luce stepped out first. She stood in the dock and she looked around her, and her face did something that was not quite smiling and not quite something else. A private expression for a private moment. The dock was low-lit and simple, metal and polymer, the industrial grammar of a place that worked for a living. And it was not beautiful, and it did not need to be. She stood in it and she breathed, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked entirely, completely still. Then she turned and held her hand out. He took it. He stepped down. Behind them, Falco cut the engine and the quiet settled around them. The quiet of a place that was not the station, not the lower rings, not the clean-voiced enforcement of the syndicate. Just air and light and the far star field and the slow rotation of a place that was trying, imperfectly, to be somewhere a person could stop. Later, much later, in the morning of their third day there, when the colony ring turned toward the star field and the panels caught the light, Davo stood at the window of the small hab they had been given, and he looked at the light coming across the agricultural panels, and he thought of what his mother had said. It was the same light, the same angle, the sea that wasn't a sea but looked like one. He stood there for a long time. He was aware of the Kinetica 7's presence in his spine, quiet now, the way fire was quiet when it had burned through everything, and was waiting to decide whether it was out or only resting. The chrome sickness markers were coming down in slow increments, each quiet day returning a little more of the margin between what he experienced and what was real. It was not fast. It was not painless. Some mornings he woke and the walls had moved overnight and he had to wait a while for them to settle back. Some nights the blue world came for him in his sleep, and he ran through it without choosing to, corridors and blue light and the geometry of things that couldn't hurt him anymore reaching anyway. But he was in there. He checked, carefully, the way Sarah had taught him to check, present in his own body in his own time, hearing his own name when he said it internally. David, Davo, Martinez, son of Mira Martinez, who worked the Ring 3 triage and pressed his hand and sent him somewhere with burning sea light in it. Crew member of a dead man's dead crew who had kept running because a dead man told him to. Someone who had been in the blue world long enough to know its shape and had chosen to come back out of it. The chrome sickness was receding in slow increments. A millimeter of ground recovered each quiet day. The gap between what he experienced and what was real closing back towards something workable. It would take time. Sarah had said 6 months and he believed her. He reached into his pocket and put the photograph on the windowsill and propped it against the glass and stood back. The burning sea, the colony light, the place his mother had put on her wall so she would know what it looked like. Real. The way she'd always said it was real. He was still looking at it when Luce came to stand beside him. She had been awake longer than him. She was often up before him, running her own calibrations, rebuilding her access tools for the future because she was not, in the end, someone who stayed still completely, and neither was he, and they had both made their peace with that. She looked at the photograph and then at the panels beyond the glass, and she didn't say anything because she understood what there was to understand without it needing to be said. She put her arm through his and leaned against his shoulder. Outside, the light kept moving the way light did when you let it, slowly, without ceremony, from one angle to another, the same light that had been burning since before Nocturne was built, before the syndicate, before the lower rings and the transit corridors, and the polite faces of enforcement personnel. The same light that had hit some colony shore on the homeworld and made a young woman think it was worth keeping a photograph of. The same light that Cress had recorded in borrowed memory before the world told him to run. The same light that Cargo had held a corridor open for, and Pill had driven toward and Kiwi had sent a location signal into because she thought the knowledge of where something was mattered more than her own survival. The light did not know any of this. It moved anyway. Davo stood in it and breathed. He was 17 years old. He was older than that. He was both at once, and the gap between them was the story. And the story was not finished, and he was not finished, and the blue world was behind him, and the real world was here, imperfect, unresolved, full of recycled air and transit corridors and unanswered appeals, and the distant ongoing hum of a machine that did not care about him and that he was not done with yet. He had started from nothing and had nothing been taken from him, and had built something out of the nothing that wasn't nothing anymore. Not a legend, not a name in the lower rings. Just a person who had looked at the mathematics and decided to be the variable that refused to cancel out. He thought of something his mother had said years ago when he was small and couldn't sleep and kept asking her questions about the photograph. Why does the sea look like it's burning? Isn't it cold? Why do you look at it in the dark? She had sat on the edge of his bunk and she had said, because it reminds me that there are places where the light is different. Places where you have to see it to believe it's real. He had seen it. It was real. The light moved. He stayed.